In the module 2 of literary criticism paper, we have English literary criticism. So that is from 16th to the 19th century, and the first person here is Philip Sidney, that of his Apology for Poetry, of course, and that is his charges, his defense against and his reply to classical reply to Stephen Carson, who attacked literature of poetry. So that, and again his argumentative method, that is we are going to see here. So Sir Philip Sidney, so he is a person who is the model of an Elizabethan courtier and gentleman especially, and he was a person who was mortally wounded at the battle of Suffin, and thirsty with excess of bleeding, he passed on the bottle of water brought to him to a poor soldier, the same agony of thirst and death. And here's the person who says saying like, thy need is greater than mine. So that kind of a person he is, Philip Sidney. And when therefore Stephen Carson dedicated his work, which is the School of Abuse, to him, he merely contented himself with rebutting his arguments in his Apology for Poetry, without even so much as naming him any word in the book. Okay, so he is often cited as an archetype of the well-rounded Renaissance man. And his talents were multifold, encompassing not only poetry and cultivated learning, but also the virtues of statesmanship and military service. And as we have told earlier, he was born into an aristocratic family, was eventually knighted and held government appointments, which included the governmentship of Flushing in the Netherlands. And he was involved in war waged by Queen Elizabeth I against Spain, and he was died from a wound at the age of 32. Okay, his friends included the poet Edmund Spenser. He wrote a pastoral romance, the Countess Pembroke Arcadia, in the year 1581, and he was original in producing a sonnet cycle in the English language, influenced by the Italian poet Petrarch, entitled Astrophel and Stella. Okay, so that is his major works here. So he was one of the best of Elizabethan age's prominent figure, and he was famous in his days in England as a poet, courtier and soldier. And his famous work is something that we need to see here, that is Apology for Poetry. Apology for Poetry. So we have here a list of his major works: The Lady of May, 1578, 1582, Astrophel and Stella, 1590, Arcadia, and 1583, The Defense of Poesy, or we could call it as Apology for Poetry. That was the first significant piece of literary criticism in the English language, and we could call him as the father of English criticism. What? The father of English criticism. And we have here Sidney's Apology for Poetry, that is in the year 1580-81. So this particular work is in many ways we could call a seminal text of literary criticism. It is not only a defense but also one of the most acclaimed treatises on poetics of its time. Okay, while its ideas are not original, and it represents the first synthesis in the English language of the various strands and corners of Renaissance literary criticism. And he is a person who is drawing on Aristotle, Horace, and more recent writers such as Boccaccio and Julius Caesar Scaliger. So it raises issues such as the value and function of poetry, poetry and the nature of imitation, the concept of nature, which were to concern literary critics in numerous numerous languages until the late 18th century. So Sidney's writings of the apology as a defense of poetry was occasioned by an attack on poetry entitled The School of Abuse, published in the year 1579 by a Puritan minister whose name is Stephen Gosson. So as mentioned earlier, Sidney rejects Gosson's Protestant attack on courtly pleasure, effectively defending poetry as a virtuous activity for the aristocracy. Okay, so this is the best work that opened the age of literary criticism in England, and which was 1585 and published after his death in 1595. So it's said to be the first important critical text in English literary criticism. And it is something. Gosson is a person who attacked poetry, and Gosson had indicted poetry on 4 grounds. So we shall see that thing. So okay. So this is deal with the 2 ideas. Poetry is divine origin. There is a social utility for poetry. So is an English defense against moralistic or philosophical attack on poetry and drama and music. So one of these attacks, Stephen Gosson's School of Abuse, was dedicated to Sidney. So towards the beginning of the apology, Sidney observes that poetry has fallen from its status as the highest estimation of learning, that to be the laughing stock of children. So he produced a wide range of arguments actually in defense of poor poetry based on chronology and authority of ancient tradition, the relation of poetry to nature, the function of poetry as imitation, the status of poetry among the various disciplines of learning, and the relationship of poetry to truth and morality. So what is Sidney's initial argument is that poetry was the first form in which knowledge was expressed. Okay, the first light giver. What? The first light giver to ignorance. The first he is mentioning lot many persons here, and fashion, weight. So Sidney concludes that neither philosopher nor historiographer could at the first have entered into the gates of popular judgment. So there is a prerequisite of knowledge in him, that is pleasure in learning and the poetry. So there is a lot many arguments he is making over there. So here we have a particular piece that Stephen Gosson who produced, that of a Puritan attack by his work, The School of Abuse by Stephen Gosson. Okay, here we have this. This particular piece he dedicated to Philip Sidney. So on that work he attacks actors, playwrights, poets, criticizes the social and moral disorder in fiction, labels fiction writing as potentially immoral actually, deems fiction as irresponsible and unrealistic, literature as an immoral, corrupting influence. So this is how he dedicated Philip Sidney that particular work. To the right noble gentleman, Master Philip Sidney, Esquire, Stephen Gosson wisheth health of body, wealth of mind. This is how he dedicated. So now we are going to see how he defended the defense of poetry, poesy, that's literature, poetry or prose, whatever. The apology of poetry defends against all the charges laid against since Plato. So he as a person, Sidney, he considers poetry or literature as the oldest of all branches of learning and establishes his superiority. And Sydney's apology, it is not only a reply to Goshen, okay, so but much more. It is a spirited defense of poetry against all the charges that had been laid at its door since Plato. And Sydney's method is that of a logician. How? A logician, and he examines it in a whole and in parts. Okay, consider the points in favor and the points against, and then set forth his main thesis that far from being despised, it deserves the laurel crown. And so that it is the oldest of all branch of learning. He says there is a quote from him, whose milk by little enable them to feed afterwards to tougher knowledge. So poetry is something superior to philosophy by its charm, to history also by its universality, and to science by its moral end, to law by its encouragement of human rather than civic goodness. So this is how he says poetry is superior with all other literary or all other disciplines. Okay. So Sydney turns the four charges leveled against it by Goshen. So there is particular thing caught from Philip Sidney, which is the ingredients of health and long life: a great temperance, open air, easy labor, little care. So this is the four charges Stephen Goshen makes on poetry. So in this are the charges in which Philip Sidney answers to him. So he says poetry is the waste of time, and second, poetry is the mother of lies, and third, it is nurse of abuse, and fourth, Plato had rightly banished the poets from his ideal world. So all this we have been seen already. So this is the first one. So taking the first, that a man might better spend his time than in poetry. So that is what his first charge. He says that if it be, so this is rightly quote from Philip Sidney, if it be, as I affirm, that no learning is so good as that which teacheth and moveth to virtue, and that none can both teach and move, though to so much as poetry. So then is the conclusion manifest that ink and paper cannot be more profitable purpose employed. So we shall say that. So he says poetry has been the first light giver to ignorance. What? The first light giver to what? Ignorance. So poetry has been man's first source of inspiration, according to Philip Sidney. So poetry is the teacher of all sciences. Scientific books were written in rhyme. Poetry can be found among all civilizations. And he says the Roman word for the poet means a prophet, actually, and the Greek word is creator or maker. So the Greek and Roman philosophers, scientists, and historians were poets, including Plato, and they wrote their books in rhyme. So if it be as I affirm, so this is the quote we have actually quoted earlier. So poetry is superior to philosophy and history. This is how he says. So philosophy teaches virtue through abstract examples. History teaches virtue through real examples from facts and records. Poetry is the link between the ideal and the real. So the poet is the right popular philosopher. The poet uses the facts of history to make them more noble by adding his own imagination. Okay, so that is his what the first argument by Philip Sidney. So in this, his point is that an essential prerequisite of knowledge is pleasure in learning, and it is poetry that has made each of these varieties of knowledge that of us, if it is scientific, moral, philosophical, political, accessible by expressing them in pleasurable forms. That is what it is poetry. So the second argument might be called the argument from tradition. This is how he establishes the poet is a liar is to misunderstand his very purpose. So the question of veracity or falsehood arises only where the person tells of facts past or present. So the poet has no concern whatever with this. He merely uses them to arrive at a higher truth. So as a poet, therefore, he can scarcely be a liar. Howsoever much he may like to be one. Okay, so the poet does not lie because he never affirms that his fiction is true. ഒരിക്കലും പറയുന്നില്ല ഞാൻ പറയുന്ന സത്യമാണ്. So the poetic truths are ideal and universal. Also said that falsehood arises only where a period tells of facts and past or present, and the poet has no concern with that. Okay. So the ancient Greek definition of poetry is even more important for Sidney, providing access into his own view of the connection between poetry and nature. Okay. And we shall see his third point. So what was the third argument? Poetry is a nurse of abuse. Poetry is a nurse of abuse. To Sidney, it is people who abuses poetry. Okay, so abuses are more nursed by philosophy and history than by poetry, and his by describing battles, bloodshed, violence, etc. So, and on the contrary, poetry helps to maintain morality and peace by avoiding such violence and bloodshed, actually. And all arts and sciences put evil effects if they are misused. So that is what he says in the third charge. It abuses men's wit, training it to wanton sinfulness and lustful lovers, poetry, and it's particularly applied to the comedy and sometimes also to the lyric, elegy, epic, into all of which the love elements enters. So, but granting that love of beauty is a beastly fault and one deserving hateful approach. So, will it not be more correct to say that it is not poetry that abuses man's wit, but man's wit that abuses poetry? For there can be poetry without sinful love. The nature of a thing is determined not by its misuse, but by its right use. So that is what he says. So in the fourth one, Plato had banished the poets from Republic is the charge. Okay, here the fourth charge that associates Plato's great name with the condemnation of poetry is without foundation. Also, for Plato found fault not with poetry, which he considers divinely inspired, but with the poets of his time who abused it to misinterpret the gods. Although even in this misinterpretation, they merely gave vent to popular beliefs. So, as Plato banishing the abuse, not the thing, not banishing it, but giving due honor unto it shall be our patron, not our adversary. So this is how he says on that. Okay, so Sidney's view that it is Sidney's view that Plato wanted to banish the abuse of poetry, not the poets. So Plato never says that all poets should be banished. He called for banishing only those poets who are inferior kind of poetry of his age, and they misuse they misuse poetry. So he says poetry is the source of knowledge and civilization force. For Sidney, goes and attacks on poetry, saying that it corrupts the people and it's a waste of time. That is the first charge. But Sidney says that no learning so good as that which teaches and moves to virtue, and that nothing can both teach and amuse so much as poetry does. Okay, that's the first charge. So poetry is not a waste of time according to him. So the second charge, mother of all lie. So he says a poet does not lie because he never affirms that his fiction is true and can never lie. So the poetic truths are ideal and universal. Therefore, poetry cannot be a mother of lies. So third one, Sidney rejects that poetry is a source of abuse. To him, it is people who abuses poetry, not poetry abuses people. So abuses are more nursed by philosophy and history than poetry. Okay. And fourth charge, Plato rejected poets. So Plato in his Republic wanted to banish the abuse of poetry, not the poets actually. Himself was not free from poeticality, so which we can find in his dialogues. So Sidney, he is a person, art is the imitation of nature. What? Art is the imitation of nature. It is not a slavish imitation as Plato views. Rather, it is creative imitation, and nature is dull, incomplete, and ugly, and it is artists who turn dull nature into golden color. He employs his creative faculty, his imagination, style of presentation, that to decorate the raw material of nature. For Sidney, art is speaking picture having spatio-temporal dimension. Okay, for Aristotle, human action is more important, but for Sidney, nature is important, because Sidney brings up nature in his work, and he compares other disciplines like astronomy, music, geometry, arithmetic, philosophy, all these things he is brought on nature, because poetry is not closed within the narrow warrant of our gifts, he says. Okay, and in his world, heroes are ideally presented and evils are corrupt. So didactic effect, okay, teaching ആയിരിക്കണം, moralistic ആയിരിക്കണം, depends on the poet's power to move. It depends upon the effective quality of poetry. So among the different forms of poetry, there is like lyric, elegy, satire, comedy, and etc. And like Aristotle, epic is the best form as it portrays heroic deeds and inspires heroic deeds and inspires people to become courageous and patriotic. So in this particular way, Sidney defines all the charges against poetry and stand for the sake of universal and timeless quality of poetry. And that is something making us know why the poets are universal genius. So we can say his classicism. So there is in his work there is Sidney's respect for rules. So Sidney's apology is the first serious attempts to apply the English rules, classical rules to English poetry. And there he wanted poetry to be to England what is the ancient Greece and Rome. Okay, so he wanted to transform like that. And so he make use of lot many things to bring classicism into English criticism. So he advocated classical meters into poetry, and here he is a person of he professes to follow Aristotle. Okay, his conception of beauty is different from Aristotle again, and to Aristotle, poetry was an imitation of natural pleasure. We have seen this, an imitation of words. To Sidney, it is an imitation for a specific purpose. It imitates to teach and delight. Okay, that he is much close to Plato than Aristotle. So that is Plato had found fault with poetry for being an imitation of an imitation, for imitating the object of nature that themselves were the imitation of the ideal patterns. Okay, according to Sidney, a poet imitates not the brazen world of nature, and which is itself an imitation of its ideal pattern, but the golden world of the idea. So it is something that the poet has the idea. The idea is a reality. So that is something he has a kind of a connection with Plato rather than Aristotle. So in this apology for poetry, has boldly faced the traditional objection against poetry. That is the first thing, and he has claimed poetry a high place in intellectual and social life as a unique vindication of poetry. So he is defended poetry very unique. He has restored it something of its ancient prestige and meaning through this apology for poetry, and his defense of poetry, he brought enlightenment and assurance to his own generation. So here in this particular way, his manner of presentation, his freshness and vigor are characteristically fully unique. So his styles has dignity, simplicity. So that is concrete ideas he has presented his work. So and racy humor are there. It is an illuminating piece of literary criticism as well as a fine piece of creative literature, we could say. Okay, so he is actually a persuasive writer who uses his wit and intelligence to leave his audience speechless. So without rebuttal, okay, he leaves little to no gaps in his arguments for critics to expose. So that is his argumentative method. So he uses Greek mythology and biblical literature because there are two major subjects that vast majority of people have some knowledge on that period. Knowledge about. So because many people know about biblical literature and Greek mythology and these all subjects, and it makes it hard for readers to refute his claims. So while persuading those who previously were versed in opinion of poetry. So the more the reader digs into the references and allusions of Sidney's work, the more amazing it becomes. So we cannot empty-handed and go and read Sidney's work, but there are lot many what we call like allusions and references that is the period. So that is essential for that particular period. So he uses literary consciousness to give ethos to his argument, and he allude lot many ancient Roman, Greek philosophers and major disciplines, Mother Nature also, Greek mythology and time-tested work. That is something that to show how poetry has been around longer than people criticizing it. So this defense of poetry and apology of poetry written in response to the harsh critique of the imaginative poetry by religious persons and the authorities like Queen Elizabeth. So he is a person who is extremely persuasive in his technique, using formats like narration of classic rhetoric, giving on the sense that he could be a historian or a professional lawyer. Okay. So this is all about Philip Sidney and so this is all the way Sidney makes poetry what Plato wished to be, that of a vision of the idea itself rather than its copy. So and a force for the perfection of the soul. So the apology therefore is not only a reply to Gozan but also albeit unwittingly to Plato also. So we should conclude with that. Okay.